They say aging is a quiet process, but some silences are heavier than others. There's a kind of hush that settles over the body after 60. It's not the stillness of peace. It's the silence of something unsaid, unspoken, suppressed. Margaret, 72, sits by her window every evening at 6:15 p.m., watching the same sun dip behind the trees her late husband planted. For over a decade, she's been alone. The world sees her as gracefully aging. But what the world doesn't see, what it doesn't want to see, is that sometimes in the deep quiet of the night, Margaret reaches out. Not for a memory, but for herself. She doesn't talk about it, not to her daughter, not to her church group, not even to the mirror, because somewhere along the way the message was made clear. After a certain age, your desire is no longer welcome. We've built a world where youth owns pleasure, where touch becomes taboo once the skin wrinkles, where intimacy is rebranded as inappropriate simply because the candles on your cake now reach 70 instead of 20. And so, the silence grows. No one tells the widow, the divorced, the single, the simply lonely elder that what they feel is not wrong, that the yearning in their body is not perverse, that pleasure is not a sin etched into the skin with every passing year. In fact, the opposite is true. Science is beginning to speak where society has gone mute. Medicine is whispering truths the culture is too afraid to say out loud. That self-touch is not shameful. That pleasure is a language the body never forgets. That the simple act of connecting with your own skin might be the key to unlocking health, vitality, and even longevity in your later years. And yet, most seniors die without ever hearing those words, because no one talks about it. Not the doctors, not the wellness gurus, not even the children who once nursed from that same body but now look away when the topic comes near. But this silence ends here, because what you're about to hear may not only change the way you see aging, it may change the way you live the rest of your life. Let's go deeper. Most people think of touch as something we receive, but science knows better. Touch, when directed inward, becomes medicine. You see, the human body is not just a machine, it's an orchestra. And when you engage in self-touch, especially in the form of gentle, mindful stimulation, you're not just feeling good. You're conducting a biological symphony that reaches every corner of your health. Let's begin with what really happens under the skin. When your fingers meet your own body in care, not shame, something remarkable begins. Your brain, yes, even at 70, 80, or 90, lights up. The hypothalamus, the command center for hormones, wakes up like a dog hearing its master's voice. It sends a signal: release the oxytocin. That's the hormone of bonding, of peace, of trust. It lowers blood pressure. It soothes the heart. It quiets inflammation. Next comes dopamine, your natural reward system. Suddenly, the brain that has been dulled by routine and isolation begins to sparkle again. You feel joy, real joy. Not from a pill, not from a screen, but from within. Then, endorphins, nature's own painkillers. Why do so many older adults feel chronic aches? Because their body has forgotten how to release the chemicals that numb suffering. Self-touch reminds the body how. And here's the secret few doctors dare to explain. When you stimulate your body with intention, not addiction, you help regulate systems that are crucial for healthy aging. Cardiovascular function, immune response, hormonal balance, even cognitive clarity. That's not New Age talk. That's neuroendocrinology. That's decades of peer-reviewed research buried under the dust of taboo. One study from the University of Michigan showed that older adults who maintained healthy physical intimacy with themselves or their partners had lower risk of stroke, depression, and even dementia. Another study out of Sweden found that gentle, consistent self-pleasure in those over 65 improved sleep quality and reduced dependency on sedatives. Isn't that astounding? You're not just touching skin, you're activating healing. You're rekindling circulation, oxygenating your tissues, resetting your hormonal rhythm. And perhaps most importantly, you're reclaiming your sovereignty over a body the world tried to take away from you. Because after 60, no one tells you this body still belongs to you, that it still works, that it still matters, but it does. And when you learn to touch it with reverence, not regret, the older brain is not a dimming light. It is a lantern waiting to be relit. And among all the habits that can spark its glow again, this one simple ritual, often whispered about, sometimes ridiculed and almost always misunderstood, may be one of the most powerful. You see, the brain is not just an organ of thought. It's an emotional ocean, a place where storms like loneliness, anxiety, and depression brew quietly beneath the surface, especially in old age. Too many people after 60 carry these silent waves inside them. They smile politely at dinner. They water the plants. They do the crossword puzzle, but inside, a kind of gray fog lingers. That fog is not just sadness, it's chemical. It's neurological. And here's what science has uncovered. Pleasure, when experienced consciously, clears the fog. Let's be specific. When you engage in healthy, shame-free self-touch, your brain begins to shift its chemistry. Not artificially like with medication, but naturally, organically, from within. Serotonin, the brain's mood stabilizer, begins to rise. This is the same neurotransmitter most antidepressants try to manipulate. But your body knows how to produce it on its own if you let it. At the same time, cortisol, the hormone of stress and inflammation, begins to drop. And this is where the story gets deeper. Because in older adults, high cortisol is a silent killer. It weakens bones, it erodes memory, it suppresses immunity. But this small, private ritual, a soft, slow, sacred act of connection with your own body, tells the brain, you're safe now. You're not alone. You are still alive in every sense of the word. And that message changes everything. Dozens of studies show that older adults who experience regular, healthy pleasure report better sleep, greater focus, higher emotional resilience, lower rates of depression and anxiety, a deeper sense of life satisfaction. In fact, a landmark study from the University of Chicago found that seniors who remained connected to their physical selves, either through intimacy or solo practices, had sharper memories and significantly lower risk of cognitive decline. Let's be honest, we spend so much time worrying about Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, brain fog, but we ignore the very tools that could keep the mind alert, alive, and youthful. This isn't just biology, it's philosophy. Because when you touch yourself with awareness, you're not just soothing the body, you're telling the brain, you still matter. You are still capable of joy. You are not forgotten. And that, perhaps more than anything, gives the aging mind something it rarely receives, permission to feel fully alive. So the next time the fog rolls in and the world feels distant, remember, your hands hold more than memories. They hold the power to lift your spirit, to brighten your mood, and to give your mind exactly what it craves: presence. You've been lied to. Not once, not twice, but for decades. Lies whispered in locker rooms, printed in outdated textbooks, repeated in hushed voices at church or dinner tables. And over time, those lies grew roots inside your mind. Until one day you believed them. But today we dig them out, one by one, gently but completely, because your health, your dignity deserves the truth. Myth 1. Self-touch is shameful or perverse after a certain age. This myth is soaked in religious guilt and cultural fear. But let's be honest, If God didn't intend for us to feel pleasure, He wouldn't have designed our bodies to experience it in such intelligent, healing ways. Science doesn't call it sin. Science calls it neuroregulation, self-soothing, and hormonal balance. There's nothing perverse about caring for yourself. There's only wisdom in understanding how your body works and honoring it. Myth 2. Older people don't need or benefit from sexual health. Who decided that after 60 your body becomes irrelevant? Not nature, not biology, not you. Every cell in your body still responds to touch, affection, and intimacy. Even more so now when loneliness and disconnection are health risks. Your needs don't disappear, they deepen. Myth 3. It's just a bad habit from youth. No, it's not a habit, it's a natural healing mechanism, like stretching, like sleeping, like breathing deeply after a long walk. Self-touch isn't about escape, it's about reconnection. A way to listen to your body, to calm your nervous system, to remind yourself that you are not numb, you are still here. Myth 4. It causes health problems like blindness, prostate issues, or fatigue. Old lies, debunked decades ago. In fact, the opposite is true. Healthy self-touch has been linked to improved prostate health in men, hormonal balance in women, better circulation, stronger pelvic muscles, reduced stress levels, and yes, even better sleep and stronger immunity. No blindness, no weakness. Just ancient superstition finally exposed. Myth 5. It's selfish or morally wrong. Let me ask you something. Is washing your hands selfish? Is feeding your soul with music wrong? Is praying, meditating, or walking alone in nature a sin? No, they're ways of caring for the spirit, and this is no different. Self-touch, when practiced with presence, is not selfish. It's self-honoring. It's how you stay emotionally balanced, hormonally supported, and physiologically resilient. So let the myths fall. Let the shame dissolve. Because none of these ideas were born in truth. They were born in silence, in discomfort, in misunderstanding. And now, at this chapter of your life, you don't have time for misunderstanding. You deserve clarity. You deserve freedom. You deserve to stand in the truth of your body without guilt or fear. This is not rebellion. It's reclamation. Every medicine, no matter how healing, carries a simple truth. The right dose revives. The wrong dose disrupts. And so it is with this ritual. The quiet act we've explored of reconnecting with the self, of stirring joy from within, can be a fountain of emotional and physical renewal. But even fountains can flood. You see, in our hunger to reclaim what was once forbidden, in the relief of finally saying yes to our own body, it's possible, gently but certainly, to slip into a different kind of imbalance. Not physical harm, necessarily, but emotional dependence, escape disguised as healing. Let's be honest. Some people, especially when isolated or under emotional distress, begin to use self-pleasure like a drug, not as a form of care, but as a way to avoid. Avoid boredom, avoid grief, avoid the hard truth of being alone. And here's where things shift from therapy to trap. Because when the act becomes frequent, compulsive, or emotionally numbing, when it begins to steal your time, sap your energy, cloud your sense of purpose, then something sacred has been turned into something hollow. Here are the signs the line has quietly been crossed. You begin to feel more tired after than refreshed. You do it not out of desire, but out of habit or anxiety. You neglect real-life connections or opportunities because of it. You feel a subtle shame afterward, even if no one else knows. You lose interest in other forms of joy, creativity, or social interaction. And if you recognize yourself in any of these, pause. Not to judge, never to shame, but to recenter. Ask yourself gently, am I using this to connect or to escape? Because when the ritual becomes a replacement for intimacy, for emotional expression, or for the deeper work of healing, it stops being medicine. It becomes a mask. Even natural things like food, rest, or love can become distortions if we use them to avoid our truth. The goal here is never abstinence. The goal is alignment. Touch should awaken you, not numb you. It should remind you of your wholeness, not become a hiding place from your wounds. So what's the remedy when it tips too far? First, awareness. You've already begun that. Second, rhythm. Create a space, not a loop. Choose intention over impulse, slow over fast, presence over urgency. And finally, balance. Reconnect with life outside your skin. Call someone, walk in nature. Write, laugh, cry, feel everything, not just the part you can control. Because true pleasure is not about repetition. It's about depth. And depth never comes from compulsion. It comes from choice. So let this be your compass if it brings you peace. What if I told you that intimacy, whether shared with a partner or found within yourself, is not just a physical act, but a doorway to something much deeper? Beyond the pulses and the pleasure lies an ancient truth. Sex, in its highest form, is meditation. This isn't just poetic fancy. It's a profound philosophy rooted in the wisdom of cultures that have thrived for thousands of years. From the tantric traditions of India to the Taoist practices of China, they teach us that sacred intimacy is a dance of presence, an invitation to inhabit your body fully, without distraction, without judgment. In this state, the boundaries between mind and body blur. Breath slows, awareness sharpens. You become a witness to your own vitality. For many, meditation is a way to quiet the mind. But sacred intimacy is a way to feel the mind, the spirit, the soul, all through the body's language. And for those of us walking the path of aging, this is a revelation. Because aging can feel like losing control. Over time, over energy, over the very essence of who we are. But sacred intimacy restores that control in a different way. It teaches us that control isn't about force. It's about surrender, about trusting the rhythm of your body, your breath, your heartbeat. That trust opens the door to a profound kind of healing, not just for the body but for the soul. When practiced with intention, self-touch becomes an act of mindfulness. You're not rushing to the finish line. You're savoring the journey. Every touch becomes a prayer, every sensation a lesson in presence, and this presence, this awakened awareness, is the true source of vitality. In a world obsessed with youth and performance, this philosophy reminds us that age brings a unique kind of power. The power to love ourselves fully, deeply, without apology. It's a power that can transform loneliness into connection, pain into peace, and silence into sacred song. So when you next engage in this intimate practice, remember, you are not simply seeking pleasure. You are entering a sacred space, where your body, mind, and spirit meet. A space where aging is not a loss but a return to yourself. Here's the most important truth to hold close. You are still alive. More than that, your body still speaks. In every heartbeat, in every breath, in every quiet moment of self-touch, there is a language of life waiting to be heard. No matter the number of years behind you, no matter the stories etched in your skin, your body is still a vibrant messenger, inviting you to listen, to care, to respond. Too often, society whispers that aging means fading away. But you know better now. Aging is not a slow descent. It's a deepening. It's a chance to reclaim your connection, your pleasure, your joy, to honor the wisdom that only decades can teach. Your journey with self-touch is more than a habit or a secret. It's a radical act of self-love, a way to stand tall in your own skin, a way to say, I am here, I am worthy, I am whole. So listen to your body's whispers, feel its strength, celebrate its resilience. Because every touch, every moment of care, is a testament to your vitality. And if this message resonates with you, if you feel the power in reclaiming your own sacred intimacy, then don't keep it to yourself. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to the channel for more wisdom that honors the richness of aging. Leave a comment below. I want to hear your story, your questions, your insights. Remember, you are not alone on this path.